All right. The last part of, if you will, the demographic equation is to kind of put these two pieces together. And again, what we're dealing with now is primarily births and deaths. We're going to get to the migration in the next discussion. But the demographic transition is a way of understanding those two pieces together. Okay, so demographic transition, first of all, is a model. It is not a statement of fact, it's history. But what it tries to explain is how crude birth rates and crude death rates, that is, measures of fertility and measures of mortality, have changed over time in different populations. And so, what we're going to be talking about are three lines, four stages, and perhaps where we're going. All right, so again, it is a model. It is an attempt to explain changes in population growth at the country level. It is an examination of how birth rates and death rates interact with each other. What it also does, though, is it says, well, okay, how does the economic systems, and when I say regional migration here, that is movements within a country, and then changes in health technology, how these all relate to how a population in a country changes through time. All right, so let's take a look at it. First of all, the model is based on really two countries, Sweden and the United Kingdom. And the reason we look at those is that they have very good data going back a long time on births and deaths. Both births and deaths were recorded within the registers of most of the churches of these countries, and that allowed researchers to go back and see how these things changed. Now, if we look at crude birth rates, what I want to point out here is that let's start with the first half of the model. The first line is crude birth rate. And if we take the two countries that the historical data was used to build the model, what we see is a fairly straightforward trend. In other words, it's very high and very kind of wiggly, if you will, up here. And then as we approach the middle part of the 1800s, it begins to stabilize and then trends downward. If we look at the same, and again, this is just England's data, but if we look at death rates, notice that we have, again, a similar kind of line and trend, but that the downward trend starts earlier than the birth trend. So crude death rate is also following a similar pattern, but it's offset a little bit. Now, if we take this across a number of countries, what we see is kind of the same thing. So again, here's Sweden's data, birth rates, death rates. They come down like this. Germany, birth rates, death rates come down like this. Chile, we see the same thing. They haven't quite come together. Mauritius, same thing. China, they all have similar trends, although there are some differences. So, this is the model. If we put all this data together, what appears to be the case is that we end up with four stages. In the pre-modern stage, which generally speaking we would say in most of the Western European countries is pre-1750, pre-1780 in some cases, what we call the pre-modern, births and deaths are both extremely high, generally speaking above 35 per thousand crude birth rate and crude death rate. Now, and if this is the case, then the population doesn't grow. In other words, births equal deaths. Population remains relatively stable. Stage two, though, is what we call the urbanizing or industrializing stage. And what's happening here, you'll notice, again, that death rates are suddenly dropping. Well, what is happening in this stage is industrialization and agricultural technology. Food becomes more stable, basic delivery of clean water begins to occur, and basic sanitation. All of those things, surpluses of food, basic sanitation, that all of this is part of the urbanizing world in Western Europe, causes a decline in death rates. Now, birth rates stay high. The argument for this is that death rates drop, but because a culture is used to high infant mortality, people continue to have large numbers of children because they fear that most of them will die, or at least many of them will die. And generally speaking, during the pre-modern or agricultural stage, children were a source of labor. So if children are an advantage here and they die, you're going to have a lot of them. The transition that begins to happen here in the mature industrial is that during this stage, at least one or two generations, imagine you're a person, a family, and you were born somewhere in this area, and you had 11 siblings, and 7 of them died. Well, you're going to have a lot of children here because you think that's going to happen. But the children from that generation now live in a family of 11 and 9 of them survived, or 8 of them survived. And the problem is, as industrialization happened, rather than those children being a surplus on a farm, those children were an economic burden in the city. And so now in the third stage, births begin to drop because the culture says, I think my children will survive and I have to pay for them. And so family size decreases. At the same time, death rates continue to decline and then stabilize. In the post-industrial phase, both of these have reached another equilibrium point, and total population again has stabilized. Now, the other pieces again that I want you to note. Stage 1, population is stable. Stage 2, this disparity between them causes population to grow. As these two approach each other, population begins to stabilize again and then becomes stable. Now, there are all sorts of factors that can modify this. Okay, again, so if we look at kind of this question of the fifth stage, it is possible that somewhere in this stage, some countries are showing a return of larger families, possibly brought on by affluence, possibly brought on by other cultural factors. Others are seeing continuing decline. Japan, for example, is seeing a continuing decline in population. Now, the other thing I want to point out is you'll notice the population pyramids look different through each stage. Stable populations here, very rapid population growth. Population is declining. You notice we have low here. And then again, falling in stable populations. And then if this begins to go in, it's a population in decline. The demographic transition can be influenced by all sorts of factors. Okay? What we see is that other parts of the equation come into play. You'll notice that Sweden and the United Kingdom both essentially had a similar demographic transition, but that was only births and deaths. In the case of the United Kingdom, starting in the mid-1830s, their population really took off and continued to grow, not because of a change in births, but because of a change in migration, much more than Sweden experienced. All right, so that is largely the end of Module 2. There will be a supplemental lecture on briefly on immigration and emigration. We will see you in Module 3.